Actually, from previous shows with my guest, Diehl, I didn't only learn that if there were a problem with a plane, it's the takeoff and landings, but also to wear my shoes. Sometimes when I get on the plane, I like to kick off my shoes and relax, but not during the takeoff and landings, because that could be where the problems could occur. Correct, Al? Thank you so much for being a part of the program.
Yes, we always tell people, and I wrote about it in my book, the most dangerous things, time in any flight is the takeoff and landing. As they say, 8 minutes before landing and 3 minutes after takeoff. Keep your shoes on. By the way, don't wear cowboy boots if you can avoid it, and don't wear those heels because they'll puncture the escape slides. So sneakers and those kind of things are much better than bulky shoes or shoes with sharp heels.
What do you think of me stating, and mainly because what you've told me, I do some shoot my video, because I think, well, maybe I shoot usually behind the wing, and I say maybe my video will show the pilot if there's a problem, hopefully not a crash, a problem that something wasn't operating well, and I want to make sure those wing flaps are open and up. I don't know what they mean, you do, but I see them opening and go, and I hear sometimes a rumbling sound. So what do you think more and more we see in the media, people with their cell phones are shooting video?
That's because people have more cell phones and they're curious, and we're all always looking out the window. And you're right, sometimes a passenger can capture something on a cell phone that really is very helpful to the investigation. In fact, there's been cases, not so much with cell phones, where pilots were informed by flight attendants whose attention was called by a passenger, we've got fuel streaming out of this left wing. Is that normal? And the flight attendant will call the pilot, and the pilot will say, uh-oh, yeah, we didn't notice that. Thank you, and thank the passenger. So it's always good to be aware. Don't panic. You can pull your call button down and say, it might just be, air, or, when the plane flies through the air, it gives off a contrail, so-called. That's not a fuel leak. It's not dangerous. So don't panic. But if it persists, you might want to call it, get a picture, call the flight attendant on your call button.
And what is the contrail? We see them.
Oh yeah, that's essentially when usually at altitude, the air is condensing and it leaves a vapor trail. A water vapor becomes visible suddenly when the air is penetrated or heated. And of course, we all saw the World War II movies with the bombers and these massive contrails of the formation of the bombers. And it was from the heat of the engine made the air, or the water in the air, become visible all of a sudden. So
nothing to do with the fuel.
No, nothing to do with the fuel. And sometimes when you'll see these contrails, particularly if there's a lot of moisture in the air, come off the flaps or the wingtips, but not to panic. It's not a fuel leak or it's not smoke. It's just water vapor you're seeing. But never hurts to be cautious. And if you want to take a picture, that's great. Sometimes, though, you'll actually catch a picture of an engine exploding, and that is very helpful to the investigation.
Very good. As I mentioned at the beginning of the show, this year, 2023, there were 7 runway incursions in the United States with commercial aircraft. That means just like right on the tarmac. And one of the more notable ones was in March of 2023 at Logan International Airport. 2 United airplanes kind of like hit each other. Their wings hit each other, which is unusual.
I think they were taxiing on the ground, so we're not talking about a collision. The real problem is if one or more of them gets in the air and they hit at hundreds of miles an hour, you're probably going to lose a lot of people. That didn't happen, fortunately. And these other instances, same thing.
What's going on?
Well, it's in the post-COVID era, people are coming back to work, and all of a sudden, a number of flights are going up dramatically, and a lot of people that have been at home because of the crisis in past years are now working on airplanes, controlling airplanes, or flying airplanes. And so there's a tendency maybe to be a little rusty. It's not that they're not trained, and they send the pilots, for example, through recurrent training. They have to take simulator checks, so it's not like they totally forgot everything they learned in flight training before COVID. But the air traffic is up, and of course some people point out that there's a lot of retirements. The senior pilots are leaving. We've got new pilots, and not that young pilots or new pilots aren't as capable, but there's a turnover, and that can cause problems. Same thing in the air traffic controller ranks. We're an aging population, particularly in this country, and so these critical skills, and maybe the biggest problem is the mechanics. People are retiring who know the airplanes, and we're training new people to work on the aircraft. So I'm going to fly in a couple of weeks, okay? So it's not like I'm telling people, be careful, don't fly, but just be aware. Listen very carefully to the flight attendants about everything from shoes to how to put your oxygen mask on. That's your best line of defense. And don't take that extra drink before you go flying. You want to be fully lucid. If anything, a remote possibility happens, you want to be able to act quickly. And if you're intoxicated, you won't. And of course, flight attendants are told not to allow somebody they know is intoxicated to board the aircraft. So don't pop that extra pill or take that extra drink. Just relax and realize that you're much more likely to die crossing the street at the airport, dragging your bag, than you are to die in a dramatic plane crash. It's just so rare. The system has been so improved. The automation is so much better. The training is so much better. And I was just lucky to see this happen over the years in the post-airline deregulated environment. In 1978, they deregulated the airlines. Everybody thought there was going to be a bloodbath, but the government and the manufacturers and the unions got on top of things, and the rate went way down rather than going up like everybody anticipated.
And the security of being on a plane, I remember the day before, we used to have hijacking of planes, right?
Yeah.
That was what, in the early 70s?
Yeah, now they've, because of the preventive measures post 9/11 in particular, you don't see many hijackings, certainly not in this country. Back in the 80s, there were criminals that were hijacking airplanes, and sometimes there were Cuban emigres. Castro released all the convicts in his jails and sent them over on the so-called Mariel boat lift. And many of these people got involved with crimes here and then tried to hijack aircraft back to Cuba. So that was in the 80s when I was working with security and working in the FAA headquarters. So fortunately, 9/11 taught us a lot of things about boarding. And it's inconvenient to take your shoes off and go through the scanners, but it's certainly a great preventive measure. And we don't see the hijacking or the bombs blowing up aircraft like we did in past decades.
So that makes it, you're saying, Diehl, safer than ever.
Absolutely. Even with all these incidents, the 5 or 7 incidents earlier this year, flying is still incredibly safe.
But not being doomsday, but we do have the one in outside of Kathmandu in Nepal. There was an airplane crash earlier this year. 72 people were killed. Tell me a little bit about that plane crash.
Well, actually, it was a new aircraft, an experienced crew, but they put a new airport in Kathmandu, and the 2 captains were actually flying, and they changed the direction of landing, and one of the pilots, the so-called pilot not flying, apparently grabbed the propeller controls instead of the flap controls. When you land, you put the flaps down, and this individual inadvertently actually shut the engines off, technically he feathered the engines, which made them not produce any thrust, and the plane fell out of the sky at low altitudes, and unfortunately none of the 72 crew members or passengers aboard that twin turboprop. It was an Airbus type turboprop, but that airplane had a safe record. But I used to design cockpits, and you try to think of every way you can, a pilot can make a mistake, but you can't totally eliminate it. And it was just, I think, a combination of a new airport and a change of a runway heading, and not inattentiveness on the part of one of the pilots. If you shut the power off at low altitudes, you don't have time to restart those engines or get the propellers working in this case. So.
And how do they find out that was the air?
Well, they had the black boxes, the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder actually recorded what happened. So they knew for sure within weeks, certainly, probably days after that event, what happened. Now, the other major crash was last year, and that was a China Eastern Airlines 737. Now, let me tell you, China Eastern Airlines is owned by the People's Republic of China. It's owned by the government. And in China, and in most countries, the government does the investigation. Some people would say that's a conflict of interest. So they've been very coy about what happened. But many people, I wasn't working on the investigation, and I'm not part of any lawsuit or anything as an expert witness. But many people believe that that pilot who had suffered financial problems and was being downgraded by the airline and was telling people he blamed the Chinese government. He lost a lot of money apparently in real estate investments. So they think, and now that he was downgraded, he couldn't pay off. He had calls coming for investments that he made, and he wasn't making as much money as he had before they downgraded him. So the suspicion was that he just literally flew the airplane into the ground. We saw that happen in, it was 2015 with a co-pilot who locked the other crew members out of the other pilot out. And he flew in, that happened in France. It was German wings. And that pilot thought he was going to be medically grounded. And his job before he went to work as a pilot was literally the fries man at Burger King in Germany, and he didn't want to go back to being to a menial job after having the prestige of being an airline pilot. And again, it was ruled that he committed suicide and killed over 155 people.
But we don't know what the results of the China.
No, that's because the government is running the investigation, and they're what we call slow rolling the investigation. They're not real eager to admit liability. This is Alan Diehl speculating, but it seems like they probably know a lot more than we know. The NTSB was asked to listen to the voice recorder, so there's probably a few people in this government. But when you're the NTSB and you're working on a foreign accident, you are not allowed to discuss that except with the foreign investigators that are running the investigation. So it's well understood you will not disclose what you know. So there's probably a few people in this country that have a good idea of what happened, but the Chinese government is taking their time to admit any liability, because the guy particularly denounced the Chinese government for not regulating these real estate investments that he lost all his money in. So yeah, there's a lot of concern about...
You've been called as an expert witness?
Yes.
Some of these investigations, tell me a little bit about that, the history of that.
You don't do that as a government employee. I did the government for 30-some years investigating crashes, but every once in a while a lawyer will call me and describe what happened and ask if I would be interested in taking the case. And in some cases I'll say, Counselor, I don't think I can testify to that. That would not be accurate. I'm technically an officer of the court, so I can't say what you want me to say as an expert. But oftentimes they can find somebody else because they.
But what makes you an expert?
Well, having done it for 30 years and having a PhD in research psychology and being an aircraft designer and surviving a plane crash made me very credible with jurors. And oftentimes when I would show up, the other side would just settle the case. And it was funny. I don't think I'm telling stories out of school, but we know the Virgin Galactic has a spaceship operation here in New Mexico. But they lost a test airplane several years ago, and the lawyers called me, and I looked at the design of the aircraft, which has been changed, the spacecraft. It's been changed now, and the training has been changed. But I told those lawyers, Mr. Bronson, who owns Virgin Galactic, is going to have the best experts in the world, and they're going to say these facts, and I can't contradict that under oath. So, my advice is settle the case. Do not go to trial because you're going to lose many millions of dollars. The pilot was able to survived, but the co-pilot, who, much like happened in that Nepal accident, he mismanaged the controls, partly because the simulator, that aircraft vibrates when it goes up, that spacecraft, and their simulator didn't vibrate, so he moved the controls.
Was that in Mojave Desert? Where was that?
No, yeah, it was out in California several years ago, but fortunately the captain, the pilot in command, was able to survive the accident, but the co-pilot who mismanaged the controls, he extended to what they call the feathers, or kind of like flaps, too soon at supersonic speed when it was climbing, and the plane was destroyed. And I said, bad design, bad training, counselors, you're going to pay dearly for this, so you don't need to hire Diehl. You just need to settle the case with the owner of Virgin Galactic, because he lost millions because he couldn't fly the spacecraft. I guess they're resuming spacecraft flights now from southern New Mexico. But I will tell you, the training and the vehicle itself has been modified, so that's not a problem. If you've got $100 and some thousand and want to ride in space, it's much safer because they learn from those accidents. That's what we do as investigators. We find out what happened. We try to analyze and learn why it happened, and most importantly, we come up with ways of preventing it from reoccurring. So they've done that with the spacecraft, so hopefully they'll have a lot of success.
So you have testified as an expert, but also the national media and the local media tend to call on you whenever there's an airplane crash somewhere in the world.
Yeah, I've done both military and civilian crashes, and one of the things I did when I worked for government, when I uncovered senior officials lying to Congress, for example, I exposed them, and of course I was with the FAA and told, you need to leave Washington. The FAA administrator is not happy with you, and if you don't leave, you will be in a lot of problems. And at that point, I left Washington and went to work for the Air Force. But unfortunately, I soon discovered the Air Force had some cover-ups also, and I eventually decided to become an Air Force whistleblower after becoming an FAA whistleblower. And yes, they do retaliate against you. But fortunately, an ABC News guy wrote a book about me, and I was on all the major networks in Washington Post and New York Times, so they didn't do what they wanted to do, is take my pension and fire me. They had to they demoted me and prevented me from investigating military accidents, but I was able to retire and keep most of my pension. It was expensive. But, if you're a whistleblower...
You're saying somebody from ABC News wrote a book?
Yeah, it's John Nance, was an airline pilot that was working for the unions and ABC. You see him on TV all the time. He wrote a book called Blind Trust, and it was all about how I sort of revolutionized the way plane crashes were investigated right after the Airline Deregulation Act. I figured I was going to be in trouble when I went. It was kind of a Mr. Smith goes to Washington. I thought this was going to be a short trip, because if I'm here, I'm going to try to make a difference. And yeah, they're going to run me off because I'll do things that you're not supposed to do as a bureaucrat. Instead, the NTSB promoted me, and then the FAA hired me. And I learned that there were problems at FAA, and they were lying to Congress. And so I had to leave FAA. Fortunately, John Nance's book had come out, and the Air Force didn't know I was a whistleblower, so they hired me. I was a former Air Force Academy cadet. I designed aircraft for the Air Force, so it was logical that I would go to work. But I always tried to make sure they did the best investigation and not blame a dead pilot or a mechanic or a controller, when in fact it really was some general that made the mistake and was being protected by the investigators. The military investigates its own accidents. They don't have an NTSB that's totally independent of the Pentagon. I've advocated for that in my book, this Air Safety Investigator book, but so far...
So again, they're investigating themselves, just like the Chinese government is investigating their own self. In the few minutes we have remaining, Diehl, what would you like to share with our public about flying in this day and age and going forward?
Diane, I have to say that flying is incredibly safe, not just because of the few things I did back in the day, but it's continued to improve exponentially. And you're literally far more at risk driving to the airport than you are once you board that airplane. You're probably in the safety zone. So don't worry about it. In a couple of weeks, I'm going to jump on an airliner and fly back east on a vacation. And I'm not going to be worried. I'm going to listen to the flight attendants, even though I wrote some of those scripts. I know what they're going to say. But, you know, pay attention to the flight attendants. Know where the exits are. Wear sensible clothing. Don't wear this kind of stuff, nylon and rayon. Wear cotton or leather or non-synthetic materials anyway. And don't take that extra drink so you can help protect yourself while you're flying, would be my message. But you're more likely to die from an infected bee sting or something like that than you will on an American airline in this country, flying in this country.
That's good to hear. What do you think of now the, I think the National Transportation Board is saying that if a plane is delayed, now they have to be compensated, the passengers. I mean, that's been a huge problem since Christmas with Southwest Airlines and a lot of inconveniences. And people are greatly inconvenienced, but if they know the pilot has been flying for X amount of hours and he can't, or the crew can't be on the plane anymore, they're probably safer being delayed than, but it's been very troublesome what's been going on.
I think it was actually Congress. Now, there's a passenger advocacy organization, and I've worked with them on occasion gratis, just to, you know, improve the size. They're complaining about the seats getting smaller and the rows getting more.
Which they are.
And it is a problem. But yes, they were able to convince Congress. Now, I don't know if the bill has been signed by President.
I think it's gone into effect. It's from the Department of Transportation.
Okay, so they are going to start
compensating. Well, they used to compensate with meals, with hotels and whatnot.
I think it was voluntary in the past, but now I think if you're right that it's become law. I didn't know if the president had signed it. I knew they were pushing it through the Congress. But it's just a cost of doing business. And yes, if you have to stay overnight or whatever, it's not just your hotel, but you suffer other inconveniences and expenses. And now at least the airline will have to compensate you for it. So it's probably a good move on the part of Congress. I salute that. And I do think they should look at the size of seats and the distance between the rows. I know the airfares will go up if the seats get bigger, but it's, we've got a population that's growing in size and age, so it's probably best that Congress listen to the passenger and the experts, passengers advocacy groups and the experts, and do something about that. They are studying it. The FAA is studying it. Hopefully we'll get some relief.
Will government have a right to tell this private industry to make the rows larger and the seats bigger? I mean, they're all doing it because they want to captivate more dollars for their industry, but
I believe, I'm not a lawyer, but I believe, yes, if the Congress mandated a certain seat width and distance between, they call it pitch, between the rows of seats, the airlines would have to abide by it. Just like now they have to accommodate handicapped passengers. They didn't have to do that. Now it's the law. So yes, the government can mandate things like seat size and distance between seats, as well as the treatment of passengers and even animals. There's no new rules about what they call companion animals now. Used to be you could bring anything aboard an airplane and say it was a companion animal.
But we've seen this year a lot more problems.
Yeah, because people are flying again, and like we said, everybody's kind of getting back into the swing of it. The airline employees and the government employees are. So I don't see this as a great problem. I think it's a temporary problem as we return, and we know the aircraft are getting safer and the automation on the ground is safer, And so,
So that's the good news.
I think
Even
it's
if
great
we're stuck
news.
on a tarmac for 3 hours.
Yeah.
Al Diehl, thank you so much for being a part of this program and for sharing your expertise with our audience. And happy flights to you, safe flying to you and to our audience. I'm Diane Kinderwater. Thank you for watching this program. We appreciate KCHF TV for bringing you this informative show, Issues and Answers. Make it a great week with your family. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.